Want to welcome back to the program Dr. Carl Hart. He is a professor of psychology at Columbia University. He's the author of Drug Use for Grownups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm here with Emma Vigeland, and I think it's been, I think 8 years. Since the last book. I think we have seen you. Appreciate your coming. Let's this book is in some respects a little bit of a memoir, a little bit of a treatise. But let's start with just sort of what your own personal experience on what led you to write this book.
Yeah, so you said you correctly said that it's a bit of a memoir, but that's just to make sure that the reader know whose hands they're in. I wanted the reader to know my story, and I wanted the reader to know that they were in the hands of an expert when it comes to drugs, and so I had to say something about my personal story. The thing that led me to write this book is my travels around the globe. In those travels, I noticed something became very evident and clear. The majority of people who use drugs, the ones that we vilify, are middle class, middle to upper class, well-to-do, typically white folks around the world. But yet, that's not the people who we oftentimes associate drug use with. These people are responsible, they meet their obligations, they are captains of industry, they're people who we respect. But yet they're all in the closet. I mean, they are these hyper-responsible people, but then they behave like children when it comes to drugs. They don't tell anybody, they lie about this behavior, and they don't fight for their right to put whatever they want in their bodies. And I was struck by that. Meanwhile, we are vilifying these people who have limited resources for engaging in that behavior. It's like, something's wrong here. And so being a person who studies drugs, I thought like, well, I have to say something about this, and I have to at least act like a responsible person. So get out of the closet, encourage other people to do the same, and expose this nonsense.
And so what is the nonsense about how we leverage drugs? I mean, you talk about some of the history of race and drugs in this country going back to post-Civil War, when we were talking about opium, when it came to Chinese workers and cocaine in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, relative to black folk. Drugs have been a mechanism in which society sort of has leveraged drugs in some ways for race. I mean, like, it's not necessarily the attack on drugs as much as it is the attack on different people.
Yeah, so let's just use American racism as a backdrop. That's just who we have been. And drugs is just another tool. So think of it in that way. So when we think about a variety of things in our society, we blame poor people, minority people, and drugs is the same way. It's like, if we want to vilify a group, we can't very well say, we hate those motherfuckers. We can't do that. Instead, we can say we don't like some activity that they're doing, and we tell people we got a war on drugs. Not a war on Black people, not a war on Latino people. We have a war on drugs, but in effect, it functions as a war on those folks. That's just one of the aspects of this. I mean, there are all kinds of things, there are all kinds of sort of points that can be made. I mean, people sacrificing their liberty, sacrificing their sort of desire or right to alter their consciousness, to enjoy themselves. There's all kinds of rights people have given up in the process of going after certain groups.
Okay, and so let's I guess sort of like cross that bridge over to the more sort of clinical one, which is when we talk about addiction. You argue that our understanding of addiction is completely wrong.
Yeah, so in this book, in the prologue, one of the things I try to do, I tell people, I take addiction off the table, because whenever you have a conversation about drugs in this country, a trick is to throw you in the addiction camp. Now, addiction represents a small percentage of drug effects. Small percentage, vast majority of the people who use these drugs won't experience any problems like addiction. But yet, the disproportionate amount of attention is focused on addiction. It's like, for example, if you were interested in cars, and the only information you could find on cars dealt with car accidents, car crashes. That's ridiculous, but that's what we do with drugs. And so it's true that some people become addicted. But when you know that the majority of users of any drugs don't become addicted, then that tells you you have to look beyond the drugs to figure out what's going on with addiction. And when we think about addiction, there are a number of things that could be going on. Co-occurring psychiatric illnesses, people, they no longer have worth in a society where they had worth, where they had gainful employment. There are all kinds of things that's related to the society is why people are addicted. But like I said in the prologue, I take that off the table because there are far more interesting things when it comes to drugs. I mean, when you think about a drug like MDMA, a drug that could help people to be more empathetic, help people to be more open, produces euphoria, people feel good, happiness, pleasure, you're gonna treat people better. Why are we talking about a car crash when you have all of these positive things here?
Did you in your research find that any particular drugs were maybe more prone to addiction than others? I mean, I know that you're trying to adjust the conversation about addiction to a more wholesale or holistic, like zoomed out view. But did you find that there were any differences in, say, MDMA and other drugs that you might have been working with?
Yeah, so there's a caveat. Some drugs are illegal and some drugs are illegal. And so to compare them sometimes might be like comparing apples and oranges. So with that caveat in mind, the drug that's the most addictive is tobacco. A third of the users who use tobacco will become addicted. When it comes to heroin, about a quarter to 30% will become addicted. When it comes to something like cocaine, about 15 to 20%. Alcohol is about the same range. Cannabis, about 10%. So that's the best available information we have now in terms of who becomes addicted and who won't become addicted.
And do we have a sense? I mean, and I don't want to focus too much on the idea of addiction because that's the point. But I mean, this is sort of the I guess the part that makes what you're writing somewhat controversial is this notion that it is too facile to sort of ignore the addiction aspects of it. I mean, I happen to believe that we should, at the very least, decriminalize and probably legalize the vast majority of drugs. I mean, I don't know that I know enough about drugs per se, but that the issue is, I mean, if you have like a 30% addiction rate for heroin, isn't also part of the calculus is the implications of that addiction? Because certainly with car crashes, I mean, that's also part of it as well, right? I mean, we're calculating what the cost benefit analysis is on a societal level. And it's not just a function of that there are accidents, it's what is the knock-on impact of that?
Okay, there were so many flawed assumptions with that statement, right? So when you say we are calculating this based on risk-benefit analysis, we're not. Let's go back. When we think about why drugs are banned in this country, drugs are banned in this country not because of that calculation, not because of pharmacology. Drugs are banned because of racism. So that's how it happened. That's how we ban drugs. That's number one. And then number two, if we think about car crashes, every year, 40,000 Americans lose their life because of car crashes. Nobody's talking about banning cars. We don't even have that conversation because it would be ridiculous. Instead, what we do is we say, how do we make this activity more safe? Seatbelts, speed limits, make sure people can drive, all of those kinds of things. Whereas with drugs, it's off the table. And then when you think about, let's think about guns versus drugs. Now, guns, which I am a supporter of the Second Amendment, right? But let's not forget, guns are designed to kill people. Drugs are not. In fact, drugs are designed to bring people pleasure. Drugs are banned, guns are not. Every year in this country, we lose 40,000 Americans because of gun-related deaths. I know 2/3 of those are because of suicide. So I just want people to know that most of those are suicide, but still we lose people because of gun-related deaths. Instead, what we're talking about in terms of gun control is, how do we make this activity more safe? How do we think about background checks? How do we think about other sort of checks? And I think that's a reasonable thing to do. Why in the hell do we ban drugs? That's the question, but it's not because of that calculus that you laid out. That's what people say, but that's bullshit. Another thing too is that when people say that I ignore addiction, again, bullshit. I spent 30 years studying drugs to try to help people to understand, drugs to try to help people to get off drugs, to deal with their addiction. I spent my life studying addiction. Frankly, it's boring compared to the rest of these things that I'm talking about. And we kind of know what works with addiction, but we haven't been willing to put in the resources, the efforts, and so forth. What works is that you make sure people have a psychologist, make sure they have a physician, make sure they have a social worker, make sure they have other healthcare professionals as a part of that research team, make sure they're gainfully employed, educated. All that works for addiction. But we don't want to do that. Instead, we want to say people like me ignored addiction. No, I'm trying to help you get your freedom is what I'm doing.
Well, to use your car analogy, right? It's like a seatbelt situation, right? I mean, like in Europe, they have drug injection sites or drug consumption sites. I mean, did that factor into your research at all? Because that created, from my understanding, a way safer way to consume substances in some of these countries in Europe, where needles were clean, there was supervision on site, and it's a very different way to look at it. As opposed to what the U.S. does. I mean, Portugal is an example going back decades.
Well, you said you got a number of things there. So you're talking about injection sites. You're talking about Portugal that's decriminalized all drugs. And then you think about Switzerland, where they have treatments where they actually give people heroin as a part of that treatment. So you have a wide range of things going on. So let's start with the injection sites. So injection sites, or they call them supervised consumption facilities, in these places, people can go and take their drugs and use in a clean place. And typically the place is staffed by nurses or something. And so you can get information. Now, think about this. If you have a drug like heroin, MDMA, cocaine, what have you, now you're gonna go to a facility with strangers to get your head right. I know I wouldn't wanna do that. I mean, I have a home. I would much rather chill with my loved one and do this sort of thing. So the people who are frequenting these here consumption facilities are people who are homeless, people who don't have stable housing. And so if a society really cared about those people, they make sure they have housing. And so those safe consumption facilities have been kind of put off as progressive facilities, and liberals pat themselves on the back because of that. Make sure people have housing, and then we'll pat you on the back. So that's what I advocate for, the housing first, so people can get high in their own space, like you would like to do, like I would like to do. But now let's think about what happens in Switzerland in terms of their treatment of heroin for some of the heroin addicted people. They come to a clinic twice a day, every day. They get doses of heroin, sometimes up to 1 gram of heroin. And they have a social worker, they have a psychologist, they have a psychiatrist, they have an internist, they have nurses. They have all of these people as part of their treatment team. And you know what? They all have housing. And many of them have jobs because it's Switzerland, and people are happy. And these folks are scheduled in these places to come starting in the 7 o'clock hour in the morning and 5 o'clock hour in the evening. And you know, the patients are on time like Swiss watches. They are responsible. And so these programs really work when you have these adjunctive therapies like talk therapy and the rest of these things. And you're also treating their psychiatric illnesses, and you're treating the whole person. We don't have that kind of commitment in the United States, in part because the people who we see as addicts are not the people who we think of as ourselves. Whereas in Switzerland, it's a homogenous society and they see everyone as their brothers and sisters.
What? So I get the dynamic of addiction is to the extent that it's a problem with certain types of drugs. It's like any other problem that we have with other things in society. We figure out ways of dealing with it, and we come to some agreement on what how much it's worth it. I mean, we're going through this on some level with COVID right now, right? I mean,
that's right. That's right.
Similar determination as to how much risk as a society we're willing to accept, and sometimes it takes a while to find that medium. And if I understand the premise here, that calculation has been twisted in the context of drugs, because drugs has been a proxy for, or the demonization of drugs has been a proxy for really a lot of racist attitudes and the way that we've been using that. So, but what do we do? And the idea that we need to basically provide for our citizens. Broadly speaking, we also have this problem when it comes to education, right? We expect education to make up for these deficits and whatnot. So how do you sequence this, right? Like, I mean, what's the best sequencing for this as a society to move forward?
Okay, so our founding document is kind of a nice group blueprint, but the problem is that they make you read that shit when you're in grade school. So when you become an adult, you don't know what the Declaration says. It's a short, simple document, but the ideals that are, or the promise that's guaranteed to American citizens is profound. Each of us are guaranteed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, so long as we don't prevent anybody else from pursuing their rights. That means that we can live our life as we see fit. And in like the second or third sentence, it says government should be created to secure these rights, not restrict them. And that's profound. So if we just simply lived up to that, that's a blueprint. And so like when we see somebody is using a drug and so forth, and they're happy, they're not bothering anybody, why do I care? Why do you care? What is it about you why do you care if that person is trying to be happy? And that's one of the things that we can look at. But when we do that, what we start to see is like things like the war on drugs, for example. It's not really about protecting people. That's not what this is about. We think about what happened to American factories beginning in the late 70s and continuing. They moved, they left the Rust Belt, they went to countries for cheaper labor. You have to replace those jobs. People, and we replaced them with the war on drugs. The war on drugs is now like one of our biggest jobs programs. That's the real function of the war on drugs. And so when people start to recognize what's going on and why these things happen, we pretend we have a war on drugs to protect me. Really? You put cops in the Black community to protect me? Really? That's bullshit. But people have bought it. And so I'm trying to help people to understand that you deserve the right to behave and live your life as you see fit, so long as you don't bother other people. So people sometimes say, well, what about the vaccine, COVID? Are you arguing that people have the right not to be vaccinated? No. I mean, we all are impacted if, for example, if I get COVID, I'm preventing other people from enjoying their rights. I don't have the right to do that. So I have to make sure that I'm a responsible person, and part of that responsibility is getting vaccinated. So I am not preventing other people from enjoying their rights. And that's paramount in this equation. And if people would just think about it like that, it becomes very simple.
I'm sorry, because I mean, I guess my dilemma is a little bit is, I mean, I agree with your prescription, but the issue of the sort of the liberty, it seems like that's a little bit more tenuous insofar as that. I mean, we know, right, that we're looking at a massive epidemic of, if you want to call it opioid epidemic, in terms of like overdose and usage. It's really a little bit more complicated in terms of the substances that are being ingested, but we also know this is incredibly expensive for municipalities and counties and states in terms of providing services for those folks and helping those folks. I mean, so it has the same implications for our community. When Switzerland provides those services, they're doing it through a societal mechanism that is, at odds with the idea. Like it's not just a question of like, what you do just impacts you, because if 3 out of 10 folks are going to get addicted to a substance, and how you measure that in terms of like what their impact is on society, we as a society have to provide some services.
All right, so let's unpack that a bit. So we have opioids on the one hand, the expense to municipalities on the other hand. So let's take the opioid thing, for example. All right, so the way the media, as I laid out in the book, the way the media reports about the opioid crisis is criminal. So you see the big number, 80,000 Americans died because of a drug overdose. And then they quickly mention opioids. So in the American mind, the pairing is overdose, opioids. But then when you go in the number, an opioid was in the system of maybe 45,000 of those people who died of an opioid. That when you go inside the numbers. And then when you go inside the numbers even further, what you discover is that the vast majority of those people who died from an overdose had multiple drugs on board, and we can't tell what drug is responsible. What we do know is when you take an opioid with another sedative, for example, like alcohol, or lots of alcohol, benzodiazepine like Xanax, or an older antihistamine like promethazine, what we know is that you increase the likelihood of respiratory depression. So what you do is you have this massive campaign, educational campaign. If you're going to use an opioid or these other sedatives, don't combine these medications because it increases the rate of or the potential for a suicide. And we also know a large percentage of these people, it increases the rate of overdose. We know a large percentage of these people are commit suicide. Another thing that we know is that a large percentage of these deaths are caused by tainted drugs. For example, somebody might think that they had heroin or oxycodone, and they actually had fentanyl, which is much more potent. And if you don't know you're taking fentanyl, you can increase the likelihood of overdosing. That's an easy fix. You can have these facilities that they have in Europe and Colombia, they call drug checking facilities. You can check and see what the chemical composition of the drug that you have. If we simply implemented those drug checking facilities, we would save tens of thousands of lives every year. Everyone knows it, and we haven't done it. Now let's talk about the money that the municipalities have to spend or would spend. Now, if you do like the Swiss and you make sure that your citizens are healthy, happy, they will be productive. The majority of the people in these heroin clinics also work. They are contributing to the tax base. And people want to work because work gives them a sense of worth. And we pretend in this country that that people don't want to work, but you have to take care of people. You have to make sure that you have gainful employment. employment that makes them feel worthy. And so my proposal is that you will actually save money, and you will also have a happier society.
With these treatments, I mean, I guess I mean, I agree with that. I guess my question has to do with the principle, the sort of the libertarian principle that, you know, what I do doesn't impact.
Hold up. This is not a libertarian principle that I'm espousing. This is an American principle. It's the first one laid out in our founding document. So it's amazing to me that people have sacrificed this important thing, or we put it in the libertarian camp. I think what I do impacts other people. And so it's incumbent upon me to constantly check my behavior, to constantly make sure that I'm not negatively impacting others, to make sure that I'm not preventing others from enjoying their rights. So this ain't a libertarian thing. This is an American thing. This is an American principle. And it's not that complicated.
So, I mean, I think you're showing a significant amount of faith in the American populace. If this information was provided and if these services were provided, you know, this vision would be realized. And I think a lot of that's compelling, right? I mean, when talking about the war on drugs as a racial issue as opposed to one that makes sense, you have like me completely on board there. My question would be just, would you be in favor of, if there were criminal elements or if there were harms to society that were caused potentially by people falling through the cracks in terms of addiction, that you would be fine with whatever the secondary causal element is, right? Say someone committed a crime due to trying to access drugs. You were say, fine, deal with it like that, but don't deal with criminalizing the addiction element in and of itself.
That's right. We think about alcohol. There are people in our country who get in trouble with alcohol. That every day it happens, and we just deal with it. We don't get crazy. We don't act like it's some thing that we haven't seen before. There are people who get in trouble on the highways every day. We just deal with it. The same is true with heroin. But you provide people with the best available information, and you allow adults to be adults. The thing that amazes me is that, for one, there are Americans who think they know what's best for other adult Americans. Blows my mind. I don't know what's best for you, and I won't suppose I do. All I ask of you is to be a responsible adult. When you're not being responsible, there are consequences. We have laws in place. We have all of these things already in place. And so this notion that we should tell other adults how to live their life, that's un-American, as long as they're not bothering other people.
And what about you know, what's your position on something like nicotine? I mean, you mentioned, I mean, like, what are the implications for that? Like, to what extent can we restrict something like nicotine, let's say?
Yeah, so like one of the things that happens with tobacco and nicotine is that Americans conflate the issue. You know, my PhD dissertation was on nicotine, so I know this really well. So we knew tobacco smoke caused cancer as early as 1959. But the tobacco industry came in and said, hey, we're opening up this tobacco research council and we're gonna find out for you, even though they already knew. And it was really a PR firm with lawyers and so forth. And that went on for decades of them gaslighting the American public. And then in the 90s, we realized how badly we had been gaslit by the tobacco industry. And so Americans are upset with the tobacco companies and so forth, as well they should. But that's because of the tobacco companies' deception. They deserve to have the wrath of the American people aimed at them. But when we think about tobacco and nicotine, Americans should be free to engage with that substance as they see fit. Those are separate issues, but oftentimes what we do is we conflate the two as if they're the same, and they're not. They're different issues.
And so you would apply the same kind of critique, which I would, I guess, to modern big pharma, who's also being deceptive about, I guess, what even is in, or what the purposes of the drugs that they're producing are.
Absolutely. Now we're talking about capitalism. So we have allowed companies, whether it's Nike, whether it's Big Pharma, whoever, they are manipulating the public in order to sell their product. Now, if we want to rein that in, we have to think about the way our capitalism functions. We have to think about the sort of restrictions or not restrictions that we place on these folks, a different sort of phenomenon. And I am certainly all about protecting the consumer, making sure that people have the best available information so they can make an informed decision. When the companies violate that principle, there should be consequences. Absolutely.
And how much do we know about all of these substances that we have kept illicit for so many years? I mean, obviously, you study their impact on the brain, but I mean, have we had the opportunity? Well, and to be honest with you, like I could ask this question about foods. Frankly, I'm not even sure how much research we have done. I just presume we have, but I know that it's been harder to do this type of research because these drugs are illicit. And so, I mean, how much research do you think there has to be done or has been done on these on drugs, just broadly speaking?
So when we think about the drugs that people really seek, heroin, cocaine, amphetamines like methamphetamine, MDMA. You think about cannabis, you think about those drugs, we have a ton of information on those drugs. I mean, in places like Colombia, where I'm at, every year we give thousands of doses of these drugs to people and carefully study their effects. We wouldn't be able to do that if these drugs were as dangerous as the public believes they are. We do this because of the American taxpayer. We use that money as part for grants and so forth. And so we know a tremendous amount. Just think about this. Our military, our presidents in the past have taken amphetamines on a regular basis and without incident in order to be alert. We think about something like heroin. Heroin is essentially the same drug as morphine. It just has an acetyl group attached to it, an acid group, and that group doesn't do anything pharmacologically. So the effect of heroin is really morphine. Morphine is a medicine that we use in the treatment of cancer, pain. Heroin is an improved pain reliever in Europe. And so we know a tremendous amount about these drugs. MDMA, we're now seeing that is an effective treatment for PTSD. We know a tremendous amount about dosing, how to keep people safe, routes of administration. We know a ton when it comes to these drugs. Trust me, I've been doing this work for 30 years. I wouldn't be taking this position. You know, I'm 54. I'm getting close to retirement. I had a stellar career. Why in the hell would I be putting myself out like this if I really didn't believe this? I mean, I'm tenured. I could go away and shut the fuck up and collect my paycheck and I'm good. My family's good and so forth. So I am staking my reputation on this because it's the right thing to do.
And are there drugs that you think that are out there that we have we don't appreciate the dangers? I'm thinking of like maybe benzos that are maybe, you know, that are prescribed on a regular basis, but we don't necessarily appreciate the potential dangers with those.
Well, so again, in medicine, one of the things we look at is the risk to benefit ratio. And so when you think about benzos, just like with any drug, we have that calculation. Benzos, there's a potential harm. For example, people can get in trouble because they're sleepy or drowsy and they have an accident or what have you, or there might be some memory sort of issues going on with some benzos. but the benefits outweigh the risk. And so when we take something like caffeine in the morning, you have to be up. And so you say, I know if I do this on a regular basis, I run the risk of having that withdrawal headache, which is awful. But the benefits will outweigh the risk. And so life is not without risk. We make these risk to benefit calculations throughout the day, every day. And so people, if you're looking for a life without risk, I will show you one of the most boring sort of endeavors that you want to ever see. And so you just have to deal with risk. That's what being an adult is all about.
You mentioned the racist elements of the war on drugs. And what I keep coming back to is, I guess, U.S. paternalism, and I don't know if that's central to your critique, and not paternalism in the imagined way of, what libertarians, I think, would say, right? Or like, the conservative part, the Republican Party now about how the Democrats are trying to control your life. But that does seem to be central to, I guess, your belief here and your critique. So can you expand on that, not just the racial element of the war on drugs?
Yeah, that's a great point. In the book, I talk about this sort of infantilizing of Americans. And so I don't want to be treated like a child. And that's how we're being treated. Like, I don't want people to tell me what I can put in my body as long as I'm not bothering anyone else. Of course, that's a major caveat. But we, as I was trying to point out, we seem to think that there are groups of people in our country that needs to be told how to live their life. Now, and then people say we put them in these lofty terms like, what about those people who are vulnerable? We say things like that. And then we talk about communities that are vulnerable. Really, if you cared about those communities that are vulnerable, the first thing you do is make sure they have proper education, gainful employment. You do that, I assure you, those communities will be fine. And so our sort of infantilizing is a smokescreen not to really put in place the social safety nets and also the sort of services that people need in order to thrive in a society. But it's just infantilizing.
Are you encouraged at all by, what's happened in terms of the legalization of cannabis in this country? I mean, things have moved. I think, like I say, I think the last time you were on more than half a dozen years ago, things have moved quite a bit in that time, and it seems to be accelerating at a fairly significant pace, despite the fact that apparently President Biden is really still adamantly against it, even though it's getting legalized in all the major states around the country. But are you encouraged at all by this, or do you think that it's sort of, there's a little bit of air let out of the tire, but it's not really, they're not looking at the full spectrum?
I am encouraged. There are a number of states, the growing number of states that have legalized marijuana for adult use. That's very encouraging. But the reason why they're legalizing marijuana is not so much for people's rights or for justice. It's happening because of the eye on the tax revenue that cannabis is generating. That's the main reason this is happening. That's cool, as long as it's happening. I'm encouraged also by Oregon, who decriminalized all drugs this past November. Decriminalization, although I'm aware that decriminalization has its limitations. For example, decriminalization means that people won't be arrested for possession. That's the spirit of that law. But it does nothing for dealing with drug-related overdoses. So it doesn't do anything to make sure people are not consuming tainted drugs. And that's a concern that I have. And decriminalization also, sometimes when you have racially diverse populations, like for example, Baltimore, where they decriminalized marijuana in 2014. Between 2015 and 2017, they had 1,500 arrests for marijuana possession. 96% of those were Black people. Black people only represent 60% of Baltimoreans. And so police still had too much discretion under the decriminalization laws. And when you have a racially diverse population, I really worry about police interactions with Black and brown people.
Well, it's fascinating stuff. The book is Drug Use for Grown-Ups: Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. Dr. Carl Hart, we will put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.